Joined by American historian Ronald Suny. He is the William H. Sewell Jr. Distinguished Professor of History and Political Science over at the University of Michigan. He joins us now from Ann Arbor. Good to have you on the show, sir. I'd like to start off by asking you how Putin's feelings towards Ukraine, its sovereignty, which were made abundantly clear in his speech last week, sort of fits into the actions we're seeing today.
Vladimir Putin is a very clever fellow, but he is not an historian. And the long screeds, the long treatises that he's written about Russian-Ukrainian relations and their ancient history are very strange to me indeed as a professional historian. First of all, he's made the claim, which I think is okay to make, that Ukrainians and Russians and presumably Belarusians are one people in the sense that they share culture, they share linguistic similarities, etc. But what he doesn't say as clearly as he could, and he's certainly aware of this, is that Ukraine and Russia are two separate sovereign states recognized by the international community, by international law, and in treaties that Russia has repeatedly signed over the years since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Where there's a real question in what Putin is writing is, does he recognize that Ukraine, or Ukrainians, and Russians are two different nations? That is, that they're groups of people that believe they're different, that they're separate, that for whatever reasons, whatever history they've had, whatever languages they speak, they in fact believe themselves to be an independent people, homogeneous with one another, and different from others. And therefore, in the modern times, to have the right to rule themselves and control what they consider their homeland, a territory of their own.
President Putin, in the lead up to this attack, has always been saying that Russia's security concerns need to be addressed. Looking at what's transpired since the end of the Cold War, does he not have a point?
I think actually he has a point. I don't like the way he's tried to make that point with a gun to the head of the West to make them come to some agreement. And recently, of course, he pulled that trigger, unfortunately, and now we have a war situation. But, you know, over the years, the way the Russians see the world, when they were flat on their back, when the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991, the West took advantage of Russia's weakness, of its collapse, and began, instead of forming a new world order, as had been promised, instead of thinking of a new grand security structure, they decided on, in some ways, recreating the division of Europe familiar to us all during the Cold War. That is, there was, at that moment in the early 90s, questions whether NATO should even exist. There was no Soviet power again. Russia was not a threat. But then steadily, the West decided this is an opportunity to move the alliance, NATO alliance, eastward into the old Warsaw Pact, and even in 2004, to invite in and bring in 3 former Soviet republics, now independent, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So the strategic depth, the distance between you and your enemies that any country would like to have, in fact, was eliminated, evaporated through this policy. Okay. But then it was even worse. And Putin mentions this all the time. That is, the West, particularly the United States, began to put rockets in Romania and in Poland, rockets that it claimed were aimed at Iran. But Putin didn't quite buy that argument. If that weren't enough, the Americans also abrogated 2 of the most important treaties that had kept the great nuclear powers from fighting one another in the Cold War. In 2001, under the George W. Bush administration, they abrogated unilaterally the ABM treaty, making it more possible to even have a nuclear war start. And then under Trump, just some years ago, they ended the INF treaty for intermediate missiles. So these are the kinds of accumulating things that Putin has worked into a narrative and used as a justification for his own rather aggressive and now really tragic choice of going to war.
Ronald Suny, thank you very much for coming on the show. Some great context and some really insightful analysis. Thank you.
My pleasure.